men with machine guns that suddenly popped out of the ground and started spraying us.
It was a battle that would change the course of a war and the lives of the men who fought it.
You know, when the bullets crack over your head and snap the air, hit the ground beside you, you know they're aiming at you.
And I thought, oh, Jesus, they're all over us.
They were determined to kill us all. And I was determined that wouldn't happen.
Now, from that battle comes a story you'll never forget about soldiers, young and brave, in a place called Vietnam. Tonight we have a special broadcast, the story of a battle that you probably never heard of, but it was one of the most important battles of the Vietnam War. Americans fought and died, and many of them sacrificed themselves to save the men around them. This is the story of the men who fought, of their remarkable heroism, and of their journey back to the battlefield that, in a way, they never really left. It has been 18 years since the war ended in Vietnam. 18 years since Americans witnessed a desperate evacuation from the roof of the American embassy. The end of the first war the U.S. ever lost. Today, Vietnam is alive with peace. Farmland and jungle have covered the scars of war that marked the countryside. But there are still scars on the lives of America's veterans who fought for their country and returned home to find their sacrifice had become an embarrassment. One of those veterans is retired General Hal Moore, who led one of the most important battles in Vietnam. Moore carried a dream back home with him, a dream he held for almost 3 decades.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have now landed at Hanoi Airport.
A dream that was finally realized only weeks ago.
Back again. What we dreamed about, Joe.
The old warrior who first came to Vietnam to seek and destroy now returned with his men on a mission of healing. They walked again on the old battlefield that left them changed forever.
Men who fight shoulder to shoulder together in battle. They're brothers for life.
They walked the streets of Vietnam's capital, Hanoi, the city that was, during the war, enemy headquarters. One of those who returned is Jack Smith, now an ABC News correspondent. Then, he was a 20-year-old private.
I feel as if I'm on the planet Mars, and I used to try and kill these people, and here I am visiting their country after a war that I didn't win. I just feel very strange.
They found, to their amazement, old adversaries ready to let the past be gone. They found a new generation who see the war as ancient history and Americans as charming strangers. And when they made their way to the places they knew before, they found a piece of themselves.
Didn't we have a chopper come down right here?
I crashed right there.
Was that you?
But what they really traveled 14,000 miles to find was still further away, hidden in 2 tiny clearings in a remote patch of jungle. No American has been allowed to return to this place before. Many Vietnamese believe that in the night, ghosts passed through here. It was on this ground that over 4 days and nights in 1965, the men of the 1st Air Cavalry and North Vietnamese troops fought and died in the first great battle of the Vietnam War.
It's about as close to being to hell as you can get and come out alive.
Listen to your friends crying out for help, not being able to do a thing.
When it was over, American soldiers had both won a great victory and suffered a terrible defeat.
Well, your men did a great job.
Their leaders trumpeted the victory and used it to carry us deeper into war. The defeat they buried away where no one could see it, until now. This is the story of the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, which changed the course of American history.
These guys were men. They were young kids, and they were men. You have no idea what they did.
And transformed the hearts and minds of the men who fought there. At the darkest moment of their lives, they stood together. They still do.
In a moment, the battle begins.
continues.
We intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms. I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division.
In the summer of 1965, the U.S. was still not committed to a full-scale war in Southeast Asia. But President Johnson wanted to escalate the American commitment and introduced the North Vietnamese to a new kind of warfare. Air cavalry, infantry troops transported by helicopter. The U.S. believed this was the fastest, most flexible fighting force in the world. But the enemy was eager to see just how tough these legendary Americans really were. So they followed an old Vietnamese saying, if you want to fight the tiger, you must first lure him out of the mountain. First, they baited the trap. Here, seen publicly for the first time, is the war through enemy eyes, footage from Vietnam's military archives. A U.S. helicopter shot down. North Vietnamese troops pouring along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the central highlands of South Vietnam. They set up base camps near the Cambodian border and waited. And the Tiger came. The 7th Air Cavalry Regiment was ordered to seek and destroy the enemy sanctuaries. The man for the job was Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore.
Did you have any idea how many North Vietnamese were sitting out there waiting?
None whatsoever, no.
Colonel Moore's 1st Battalion had been told to search for the enemy in a remote area along the border called the Ya Drang Valley. Moore decided he would set his helicopters down in a clearing at the base of a mountain range. The clearing was designated Landing Zone X-Ray. The mission was set for November 14th, 1965.
Intelligence that I had was that there was an unknown number of enemy in the vicinity of where I was going to be sent.
The pilot in Hal Moore's lead chopper was Major Bruce Crandall.
We went low level, and the formations are very tight, and we get right down in the treetops.
Bearing is 240 to the LZ.
28 years later, Hal Moore and Bruce Crandall are again finding their way to Landing Zone X-Ray. With them on this journey are the Vietnamese commanders who fought against them in the Ya Drang Valley. Soon, X-Ray is in sight, looking just as it did 3 decades ago.
I was the first guy on the ground in the assault. We had quiet for about 30 minutes.
Remarkably, these scenes were captured by 2 U.S. Army cameramen who were also at Landing Zone X-Ray during Moore's mission.
It was an ominous quiet. I looked up at this mountain, and I knew we were under observation. I just knew it.
What Moore did not know and could not see was that he had landed almost on top of the base camp for hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing.
I hadn't heard that kind of noise before.
Colonel Vu Dinh Thuc of the Vietnamese People's Army.
We are farmers, so we thought it was tractors. Then I realized what they were. We called them planes that lift straight up. We could see the Americans and how bright red their faces were.
We ran right across this creek bed firing our weapons into these trees and met no resistance. Very happy about that, because I had a whole battalion to bring in.
Moore had one very big problem. X-Ray could only fit enough helicopters to put 80 men on the ground at a time. Moore had to use those few men to protect the landing zone until the rest could arrive.
I ordered my men to cut the Americans off from their helicopters and trap them there.
Standing against Hal Moore was General Nguyen Huan of the People's Army. He'd been hoping the Americans would come to visit.
You cannot fight a tiger in its cave. You must drag it out. So if an enemy force stays on its base, protected by barbed wire and mines, it is difficult to defeat.
As the next wave of troops began to set down in the clearing, some of the men Moore had sent forward returned with a surprise.
We captured a prisoner. He was unarmed, and this prisoner told us there are 3 battalions of North Vietnamese on the mountain, and they want very much to kill Americans and have not been able to find any. And at that point, I knew we were in for it.
3 battalions of North Vietnamese, 1,600 men. The Americans were outnumbered 10-1. Now, protecting the landing zone meant life or death. Moore ordered 2 platoons to push up the mountain. Second Lieutenant Henry Herrick led one of those platoons, and he was much too eager for a fight. Herrick came upon some North Vietnamese scouts and pursued them deeper into the woods. Lieutenant Dennis Deal saw Herrick's platoon pull away.
Henry Herrick had fallen for a 4th grade sucker play by the North Vietnamese. They had hung a couple of people, I guess, out in a clearing, and he took off after them. I don't know why he just didn't shoot them.
It was a trap. Out of contact with the rest of the company, Herrick's platoon was quickly surrounded and attacked. Fighting to stay alive, they became known as the Lost Platoon. Hundreds more of the enemy streamed past the platoon toward the clearing. Hearing the distant gunfire, Moore sent his men forward to meet the assault. Then the battle erupted. 1,600 enemy against, by this point, 150 Americans.
They jump up right in front of you, 5 yards in front of you, 4 yards, hand-to-hand combat. Guys sticking bayonets in each other's chests. It was close. It was close.
In the middle of the fighting was 22-year-old Bill Beck and his best friend, Russell Adams. Together, they manned an M60 machine gun.
So you and Russell Adams were right about
where the tree was. We were using that tree as cover to the left of us to protect us. You know, when the bullets crack over your head and snap the air and hit the ground beside you, and dust flies and the bark on the tree shatters and breaks off, you know they're aiming at you. That's what happened to Russell Adams.
When the battle was less than an hour old, a bullet split open Adams' helmet and pierced his skull.
And he laid there motionless and tried talking. Nothing would come out. And his eyes were open. He was staring at the sky. And his head was split wide open. And I never seen anything like that in my life. And I was horrified.
Now Bill Beck took over the machine gun alone and put up a furious wall of fire, protecting the company's flank for 2 hours.
When his time came to perform for America and for the men around him, Beck did the job.
28 years later, back at his old position, Beck made a remarkable find.
Look, it's part of a GI helmet. That could be my buddy Russell's, Russell Adams, when he got shot in the head. Look at it, rotted out over 30 years. I don't want to see this guy. I got to take us home. God bless you, buddy.
Russell Adams managed to survive the fight. He and other wounded were taken for treatment to Moore's makeshift command post. More than 50 men were there by the end of that first hour, with a dozen dead piled nearby. Now, Moore sensed the enemy shifting to an exposed part of the clearing, and he made a calculated gamble. He would leave the rear of the clearing completely exposed and protect the area where he thought the enemy would strike. Charlie Company's captain was just landing.
I ran out in the landing zone, was under fire, and I yelled at him to move his company over to the left as quickly as he could and get ready to be attacked. And I hollered at him, move!
We came in here. Our other forces went over there. The plan was to encircle the Americans. Then the order came to attack.
Moore's gamble paid off. His men got to the right place just moments before that assault began.
We realized after a few minutes that it was a standoff. I ordered most of the left flank to withdraw.
They would have had a straight shot across this landing zone.
right to your rear. You'd have been finished.
Well, most likely, we'd have gone down fighting.
In combat, I don't think he had a peer. Tremendous, brave, solid person. No time was he ever overexcited, never reacted without having good plans, without having an idea of what he was going to do.
As the battle stretched through the afternoon, a UPI reporter named Joe Galloway tried to convince a chopper pilot to set him down at X-ray.
The biggest story in Vietnam was happening 1,500 feet below my feet, and I wanted to be there. Felt it was my job.
Joe would stand up to you and look you in the eye and tell you what he thought. And he carried a rifle, and I like that. So when I heard that Joe Galloway wanted to come in and join us in the fight at X-ray, and I said, okay, if he's that crazy and wants to come in, put him on a helicopter.
When night came and the enemy fire died down, Joe Galloway's chopper landed on the most dangerous terrain in Vietnam.
We jump out, we throw out all the ammo and all the water, and then we duck into the grass, and the birds go out, and we're waiting. And out of the darkness comes this voice. I'll take you to the command post, but watch where you step. There's lots of bodies out here, and they're all American.
But the worst place of all that night was 200 yards out from X-ray, with the survivors of the lost platoon.
I ordered my men to eliminate that platoon, but they met with fierce resistance. I suppose that when they had to choose between life and death, the Americans chose life.
The platoon survivors had dug in. All but 3 of them were wounded, and all the leaders were killed. Now, a junior sergeant, Ernie Savage, did the only thing he could. Using a radio taken from a dead officer, he called in artillery fire. Today, Ernie Savage is taking us to the lost platoon's position.
Cham Met.
Our Vietnamese military escort is nervous about live artillery shells still lying around.
How close were you calling the artillery in?
Right here, as close as we could get it. 30 to 40 meters it was falling. That's 105 ammunition was falling that close to us.
You were calling the artillery literally in on your heads.
Well, that's where they were. That's where the enemy was.
Finally, on the morning of the second day, the lost platoon was rescued. The gamble to call in the artillery had paid off, and now the real danger was back in the clearing, where the enemy was breaking through the lines. Al Moore sent out a distress call, Broken Arrow.
Which meant an American unit in great trouble and about to be overrun. And that code word meant that every available fighter bomber aircraft in South Vietnam had to come to the aid of that unit.
Napalm was on its way in. The only problem, 2 of the planes had the wrong coordinates.
And I looked off to my right, and there were 2 F-100 Super Sabres coming right at us at a height of probably 60 feet.
And I heard the howling. The colonel was really yelling, "Get that SOB off of us. Get him off. Call him off."
I couldn't do anything about these 2 cans that had already been dropped, which dropped right in my command post amongst some of my men.
The heat just sort of shriveled your face. And you can see those men dancing in the flames, and you've just been talking to them.
And someone said, "Get this man's legs." And when I picked him up, the boots and the flesh on his ankle came off in my hands.
And I felt those bones. I still do. It's very hard. It's a very difficult memory.
Moore told the air controller to forget the mistake and keep the air power coming. And now the battle turned in favor of the Americans.
It was like a sea of fire. If you saw the bombing, you would have thought we had all died here. It was devastating. The closer we got, the more of us died.
My command post was not sheltered at all. I had nowhere to hide. So I would just stare up at the sky to see how you did these bombing runs.
Bill Beck was also watching the sky and saw the price one of the U.S. pilots paid to protect the men on the ground.
He came down, and as he was leveling off to go back up, he got shot from underneath and exploded his the napalm or gasoline tank, or maybe fragments from the bomb he dropped came up and hit him because he was that low to the ground, and he exploded. The plane was full of flames, and he went right across the treetops. And I lay there, up there, laying like that, like that. I looked. Right treetop level, I looked him right in the eyes. Went right down there and killed. What a show.
The air assault was too much, and the North Vietnamese finally withdrew from the battlefield. U.S. estimates calculated as many as 1,000 enemy dead.
They left scores of their dead laying around, a very sad sight. Stinking battlefield.
Considering the ferocity of the battle, the U.S. came out well. 79 GIs and airmen killed, 121 wounded. But these were still the worst casualties taken in a single battle since U.S. forces came to Vietnam.
People say, what'd you fight for and everything? Hell, we fought for each other. We fought for survival. I mean, it was for one another. I was trying to save his butt because I knew he's going to save mine, and vice versa. We were a team. We were brothers.
You were the first man of your battalion on the ground. Were you the last man off?
I was the last man to step on a helicopter, yes.
What went through your mind?
I felt guilt that I was still alive.
Guilt? Why?
Well, when your men die and you don't, you feel guilty. You're the leader. That's all I can say.
At American headquarters in Saigon, they felt differently. There, they measured the American dead against the Vietnamese dead and called the battle a great victory. What they didn't know was that the battle was far from over. The North Vietnamese had more surprises waiting in the Nha Trang Valley. And this time, the Americans would not be ready for them.
Brave. A special Day One will continue after this from our ABC stations. They were young and brave. Once again, Forrest Sawyer.
The U.S. Army's air cavalry fought the first great battle of the Vietnam War at the small clearing called Landing Zone X-Ray. As far as the American commanders were concerned, the North Vietnamese had taken heavy casualties and withdrawn from the battlefield. And now it was time to move on. The problem was, the North Vietnamese didn't quite see it that way. On November 16th, at midday, the exhausted men of the 1st Battalion began to leave X-Ray. The 2nd Battalion was coming in to take their place. One of the new arrivals was Private First Class Jack Smith.
We were goggle-eyed at what we saw. I had never seen men as filthy as that. They all had this 1,000-yard stare that people talk about, the stare of someone who is 19 years old but going on 50. who has seen combat and been killing people and seen his friends killed.
By the next morning, the cleanup was over, and the 2nd Battalion was told to pull out. Headquarters wanted B-52s to carpet bomb the area. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade was in command of the 2nd Battalion. He told his men, who had come in on choppers, they must now walk in a long column through enemy territory, traveling 3 miles north to a clearing designated Landing Zone Albany. Bringing up the rear of the march was a former football player from Morgan State College in Baltimore, Captain George Forrest.
As a young captain, when the colonel says you're going to walk out, you salute and walk out. You don't stand there and have a debate about, well, Colonel, I really don't think this is what we ought to do.
The American leaders thought the battle was finished, but General Nguyen Huan was still watching and waiting and making other plans.
I thought maybe this was some kind of tactic to surprise us by walking instead of taking helicopters. So I ordered my 8th Battalion to go after them and eliminate them.
I don't know why we were walking through the jungle. I don't know why we were walking that way. It was clearly a mistake. I mean, look, what a battalion of green troops was doing, stumbling around in the jungle the day after the biggest battle of the war against an entire North Vietnamese division right next to the main infiltration route for them, in their territory, without any air cover, without any artillery with us, is just nuts.
Almost all the way to Albany, the trip was uneventful, what soldiers call a walk in the sun. Then, just a few yards from the landing zone, 2 unarmed Vietnamese soldiers were found hiding in the bushes. Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, a young Yale ROTC graduate, was in the lead company.
Colonel McDade wanted to interrogate them, and he brought his entourage forward up the column, and for about 20 minutes interrogated these guys.
Now, he was about like this, just like this, hot like this.
Probably about 1 o'clock, so a little hotter.
You remember him calling you up?
Oh, yeah, I know that I was up here.
With all their leaders called forward by Colonel McDade, the men of the 2nd Battalion just sat down right where they were. It was all a terrible mistake.
We just dropped down on our packs on the ground like this and opened our shirts and lit cigarettes and drank water. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited.
We go forward. We pass through at least one company, and these guys are sitting, smoking, joking, and I'm thinking, not a good idea.
And then whack, everything opened up. Just incredible.
At that point, I was in a half crouch saying, what is this firing that's going on all around me?
The firing was a perfectly sprung North Vietnamese ambush. It came the moment George Forrest reached the clearing, with Larry Gwynn standing nearby, and Jack Smith caught back in the middle of the column. The first mortars cut the officers off from their men. Then, North Vietnamese troops opened fire all along the column.
And the 1st platoon said, we're surrounded and being overrun. Bingo, we lost contact with it. And the 2nd platoon, mortars started dropping on them, so nobody knew what anybody was doing. But I popped up, and I could look across where we just exited the jungle, and there were 20, 30, 40 North Vietnamese troops walking right across where I had been 10, 15 minutes later. And I thought, oh, Jesus, they're all over us. And they were.
So what happened in the woods then was individual lieutenants jumped up and grabbed their platoons, 30 or 40 men, and said, follow me. And some of them went in that direction, and some of them went in that direction. And the ones who went in that direction got out of the ambush, but most of them went into that direction, and the NVA were right over there, behind the trees and the anthills and tied up in the trees. Dozens and dozens and dozens of men with machine guns and submachine guns suddenly popped out of the ground and started spraying us. We were running toward them. 2 platoons of my company just fell down like you take a scythe and you cut grass. They just all fell down.
And then I turned and went back there to the far side of the field, and the Haven platoon was coming across the field. And everybody was down on the grass, and I said, here they come!
What in the world went through your mind?
Kill as many of them as you can before they get you, that's all.
Everybody was fighting like hell. Within a few minutes of the ambush being sprung, they were mixed with our people. It was down to 3 or 4 men fighting 3 or 4 men.
Just crawling through this grass?
Crawling through this grass, or you'd have like an American machine gunner and a couple of other Americans there, and you'd have 6 North Vietnamese here and 6 here. Jump them, shoot them, bayonet them, kill them. Look for the next clump of Americans. And I saw right in front of my face, and right above our heads, the muzzle of a machine gun firing through the elephant grass. And the firing was so loud that I hadn't noticed it. So I took my rifle, put it on full automatic, and stuck it through the elephant grass to where I thought the gunner's head would be, and hit something soft and squeezed the trigger. And emptied a magazine in this guy's head, blew his head off. And so when the shooting started, when they triggered the ambush, the companies were leaderless, all leaderless. And the only man who made it back was the guy at the rear of the column, George Forrest, Captain Forrest.
At the sound of the first shot, Forrest began to sprint back to his men.
The desperation is what drove me. We knew that there were 126 guys back there waiting for somebody to come back and say, guys, this is what we have to do in order for us to get out of this situation.
He called us forward a little further.
It was a remarkable feat. A distance of 600 yards, through thick underbrush, under fire the entire way. Running alongside him, both of his radio men were killed. But somehow, George Forrest made it back to his men.
Do you remember the run?
I only remember this grass and how sharp it was.
You understand that that run kept your men alive?
Something did. I don't... Something kept them alive.
But in the center of the column, the survivors were on their own.
I must have been about the only man in the first 2 platoons who wasn't dead or wounded in the first 5 minutes.
It's hard to imagine this melee that's going on. And you're only able to see, what?
A few feet in front of me. I was in a little open area like this where there were 3 or 4 Americans, all horribly wounded, except for me. There was a guy called Sergeant Jadrewski, an older guy who'd been in World War II in Korea, and he was dying from a chest wound, lying on his back. And I was comforting him and bandaging him up. I heard North Vietnamese coming. I played dead, lying on the sergeant's shoulder. If you were the sergeant, I lay with my head on his right shoulder. North Vietnamese guy lay on top of me, using me and the sergeant as a sandbag for his machine gun, and started to fire. Hot shell casings were falling on my back. The only thing that saved me was the fact that the guy lying on top of me was shaking even more than I was. He was probably about my age, and he was shaking like this. The combat is terrifying. My friends were firing rifle grenades at this group of North Vietnamese. Finally, they connected. One of them landed right here in the sergeant's armpit, blew his whole body away, and hit me right here, and cracked my jaw. Another one hit me in the leg, but it killed the guy on top of me. I passed out. When I came to, everybody around me was dead. Well, I just barely hung on to reality. I mean, I was on the verge of going insane from fear. I just held on to a little bit of something inside me that kept me from going nuts. And I said to myself, if I stand up and say, guys, don't shoot, the North Vietnamese will kill me. If I lie here, my guys will hit me. Crawled to another place. They got hit by machine guns and mortars, and everybody there got killed or wounded. And later that afternoon, mortars, they started to mortar us. One got me in my right leg, and I almost bled to death because it cut a vein in my leg. I tore the bandages off my face and tied it around my leg and made a tourniquet until I screamed with the pain, passed out again, woke up. I was alive.
At the rear of the column, the men in George Forrest's company rallied when they saw their commander.
We just moved off the trail, maybe 100 meters, and set up a perimeter. We knew that everything inside that circle belonged to us. Anything outside was suspect.
But at the front of the column, in the clearing, the officers were convinced their men had been wiped out. They radioed for help.
When you have a battalion of Americans almost overrun and chopped up like that, it's something I wish on nobody in this world. Either side. What saved us was the air strikes.
I heard the Sky Raiders coming over the trees, and I said, oh, God, don't drop bombs or napalm on us, please. We're too mixed up, the North Vietnamese and the Americans. You'll kill Americans. And I saw things dropping out of their bellies, and I went, oh, no.
First napalm canisters went across that field and hit the top of the trees, and the napalm
Just
came
right here.
right across that field, 200 meters.
And jellied gasoline trickling down like stalactites, and to see 15 or 20 North Vietnamese soldiers jump up from underneath it and try to escape, and the jellied gas just dripped down on them and engulfed them all.
And then there was a blast of heat, like you open up an oven door, and the grass on top of me curled over from the heat. I heard people screaming, and I heard them hollering in English, not just Vietnamese.
There's no doubt that the hard decision to call in napalm saved more lives than it cost, but it must have cost American lives.
Well, it certainly killed a lot of North Vietnamese forests. And I don't know if it killed Americans. Most of the Americans that I know and saw hurt by napalm had been horribly wounded already and perhaps dead. And I have to believe that. I have to think they were dead. To survive with that thought that we dropped napalm in on our own people.
Nighttime. The napalm held off the enemy attacks. The officers and George Forrest's company were safe inside their perimeters. The North Vietnamese came back for the others.
So they tried to come in and kill us. They were walking around killing the wounded.
And you knew that?
We knew that.
And we knew that.
And then you could hear it.
Yeah.
Right? And we could hear it. Right next to us, they'd come up and they'd go, oh, blah, 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 in Vietnamese, and then you'd hear, no, no, and kapow. And then, you know, ha, 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 and then the next one. Right?
And so the urgency for us was we needed to get out there and at least get to these guys to provide some kind of protection. We didn't know how many, and that was one of the problems. Once we
Soldiers from George Forrest's company did manage to rescue some of the men trapped in the long grass. And the others?
We found men in the morning who'd been tied up and shot. A couple of them had been tied to trees and shot. They systematically killed our wounded. The next day, we shot their wounded, too. We weren't very happy. And I said, don't shoot, don't shoot. And they said over the radio, we're killing North Vietnamese wounded. I said, don't kill the wounded, please. Don't kill the wounded. And they said, nah, we're going to kill them anyway. People were angry. People were really angry.
And if anybody has never walked a battlefield with 200-300 torn, bloating American and North Vietnamese bodies, then they shouldn't feel qualified to talk about the glory of war, because there is none.
And it was just horrible. It's the most awful thing I've ever seen in my life, and I'll never forget it. And this certainly brings it back. About 150 men died right in these woods right here. And a lot of them were my friends, real good friends. I'm so sad they're dead. I'm so sad they're dead.
In the end, more than half the battalion at Landing Zone Albany were casualties. 121 wounded, 155 dead. It was a devastating loss. And for military commanders, it presented a very real public relations problem. What the U.S. Army did next would help pull an unsuspecting nation further into war.
In a moment, the aftermath.
Mashed potatoes.
To U.S. military leaders. How could the greatest fighting force in the world win an overwhelming victory one day, only to be crushed the next day? The Army never really found the answer to that question, and the American people were told a lie. Look at this Army newsreel put out after the battle.
fierce firefight resulted. It was, in the end, another disaster for the enemy. The enemy losses in dead and wounded were tremendous.
To this day, the Army does not even acknowledge there ever was an ambush at Landing Zone Albany.
The American victory proved that the best of the enemy forces could be stopped cold and destroyed in their own sanctuaries.
Was there a cover-up of what happened?
In essence, yes. I sat there in a press conference where a brigadier general briefed on this battle and said there were light to moderate casualties and the Americans won. And I stood up in the back row and I said, General, that's bullshit and you know it.
Obviously, the truth was not told, what happened at Albany. And for some reason, the headquarters down in Saigon did not want that truth put out, obviously.
Even the survivors were expected to join in the charade. Thanksgiving came just 8 days after their battle. General William Westmoreland, Supreme Commander of the American forces in Vietnam, came with it.
I want to congratulate you on your distinguished victory. You men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, have distinguished yourselves.
General Westmoreland saluted us,
You fought bravely.
and he stepped down from his stump and strode off with his entourage behind him, and we all sort of went back to our turkey and wondered if he had any idea of what we had just been through.
No longer could the communists hope to win the war on the battlefield.
Officially, Albany was not only a victory, it was a victory grand enough to justify a war.
Ia Drang had proved beyond question the soundness of the air mobile approach to ground warfare.
And they looked at that body count in Saigon and said, this is the way to fight this war. This body count is satisfactory. We will embark on a war of attrition.
There's some voice that tells me you can almost date the rot at the heart of the American effort in Vietnam to that week.
Ironically, the battlefield at Landing Zone Albany taught the North Vietnamese a powerful lesson too. But they learned something very different from the U.S. military leaders.
We learned the Americans' weaknesses and were convinced that we could defeat them. The point, though, is the price in casualties that each side was prepared to pay to win the war. We were willing to pay a very high price.
Watch that hole.
Today, the men who fought in the Ia Drang Valley believe they alone can really understand what happened here. And they alone can find a way to bury the past. And so, 28 years after it all happened, they form a new circle on the battlefield, a closer one that honors those who fell on both sides.
Once again, we're back with our dear brothers. God rest their souls.
Well, I'd like to say for the 8 companies, 2nd of the 7th, and the men of the 2nd of the 7th who fought here and did a good job, you gentlemen who weren't here could be proud of them. They died a dirty death, but they fought like hell, and I'm proud of them.
And all my friends in Charlie Company and the column who died, our thoughts are with you. You are always in our thoughts, my friend. We love you still.
Rest in peace, gentlemen.
Amen.
Amen.
Coming to this place was hard, to honor the dead and make peace with old enemies. Leaving is harder still. But now the circle is complete, the mission at last fulfilled.
This is a sacred spot to me. So many men died here. And one way or another, I was going to get back here with my men. It's a sad feeling, but it's a great feeling. I can close it out now.
Every year, these men come to another sacred place. And this year, after the return to the battlefield, the visit is the most special of all.
The battle at the Ia Drang Valley was one of the most savage, vicious battles this country has ever seen. I'm proud that I served there, and I'm proud of all my buddies that didn't make it home. And I will live by that always.
I see 305 names of young Americans. God knows what they could have contributed to our country. National treasures, national tragedy. Whether they were draftees or young lieutenants out of Yale, wherever they came from, they were the best of us.
The Ia-Drang Valley is still in the military. Bill Beck is now a commercial artist in his hometown of Steelton, Pennsylvania. He's working on a painting depicting the battle, and he and Russell Adams are still best friends. Bruce Crandall flew 756 more helicopter missions. He was shot down in 1968 and broke his back. Today, he's fully recovered and living in Mesa, Arizona. Dennis Deal is a financial officer with the U.S. Postal Service in Oklahoma City. Ernie Savage is a civilian evaluator of Army Reserve training at Fort Benning, Georgia. After 21 years in the Army, George Forrest retired with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He's now a vocational training coordinator in Leonardstown, Maryland. Of the original 146 men in Larry Gwynn's company, only 15 were still in Vietnam a year after the battle. Gwynn was one of them. He's now a writer in Boston. Jack Smith is an ABC News correspondent in Washington, reporting for This Week with David Brinkley. Hal Moore retired from the Army in 1977 as a 3-star general. Today he lives in Auburn, Alabama. Joe Galloway covered other wars before becoming a senior writer for U.S. News and World Report. Together, Moore and Galloway wrote a critically acclaimed book about the Battle of the Ia-Drang Valley called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And that's our broadcast for tonight. I'm Forrest Sawyer. Good night.